From Hollywood to Capitol Hill, even newsrooms, including right here at CBS, high-profile men have been forced to resign over sexual misconduct claims.
And now the New Yorker is putting a spotlight on the financial world. Writer William Cohan says a rigged system is allowing Wall Street to hide its sexual harassment problem. He's written extensively on the issue, including a book called Why Wall Street Matters. So you're here. Thank you so much for coming here, because it's something that Emery and I have been talking about for a long time. And full disclosure, I worked on Wall Street for 20 years. I started as a stockbroker at Shearson Lehman.
And I worked on Wall Street for 17 years as a M&A banker, so I know
so you
exactly.
know, this has existed for many, many years. And yet, over the last couple of months, the media world, Hollywood, Ford Motors has gotten a lot of spotlight turned onto them. Restaurants, but Wall Street so far, even Silicon Valley in some instances, but why has Wall Street sort of remained on the outskirts of this discussion?
Well, that's what I was trying to get at in this piece, and it's, of course, we know that it isn't at the outskirts. It just hasn't been called out for it yet. In many ways, Wall Street was sort of at the front line of this whole phenomenon when it was sort of unfortunately accepted behavior. So 20 years ago, or whenever the Boom Boom Room incident was at Smith Barney, and then another a lawsuit against Smith Barney brokers more like 10 years ago. This has been going on a long time. I mean, when I wrote my first book about Lazard, where I had worked, I included in there chapter 14, It's a White Man's World, where I went through chapter and verse about the way women were treated at Lazard. That book came out 10 years ago, and you know that chapter had no effect whatsoever, even though names were named about women who were mistreated and the men who mistreated them. I think it's just it was an accepted way of how you got ahead, and I think, unfortunately, some of the women realized that it was what they had to accept to get ahead too, and there was so much money at stake. I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars over the lifetime of someone's career, and if you sort of blow the whistle, you're going to be blackballed from the industry. And that's going to be.
Before you say, you know, and I want to make a fine point of that, because in your piece for the New Yorker, it's sort of heartbreaking to read a comment, a quote from Lisa Carnoy, who was ranked as the 4th most powerful woman on Wall Street.
That was the point I wanted to make.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she says this quote. I mean, it's, you know, many of the women who try to succeed in the world, including myself, are very driven and ambitious, and are willing to put up with terrible behavior.
Yeah. I think what was stunning to me about this piece in the New Yorker is just how accomplished many of the women that you spoke to were. That you were talking to VPs at firms, a woman who ran her own wealth management firm. There's an idea that to be susceptible to this sort of behavior, you must be lower down, right, in the ranks, and there's a male superior that's
a power imbalance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in this case, these are powerful, powerful women who just felt like they had to suck it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
And in fact, that is what Lisa Carnoy, in fact, those are the words she used.
Suck it up.
She had to suck it up. And you know, I remember when I was writing the book about Lazard, and learning the history of the firm that I had worked at, because of course they don't share with you the history of your firm when you're there. You're just doing your job, right? And so they'd hired one woman, and because basically the equal EEOC sort of demanded that they had to hire a woman. And then they were thinking about hiring a second woman, and from the top of the firm came down this mandate that said, you know, why do we need to hire a second woman? We've already hired one.
Right.
So this, the mentality at these firms, by the way, has changed a lot. So we have to give them some credit, but they used to be private partnerships run by men with their own money on the line every day, and you know, it was just a boys' club, pure and simple. And the women that were introduced to the firm, these firms were subjected to all sorts of bad behavior. And heaven forbid they might actually be attractive women. Forget it. I mean, it was like catnip. I mean, one thing I write about in my Lazard book is how the women who happened to be attractive who were at Lazard, you know, the men honestly couldn't control themselves. And there was never any punishment.
It's, you made such a good point, Emery, and it's something that I saw with my own eyes, which is you could be a powerful woman. You could be a senior vice president, and you could have some, because the power dynamics that we've talked about in newsrooms, for example, or in Hollywood generally involves a more powerful individual exploiting the power dynamics of somebody who's much lower down on the totem pole. On Wall Street, you don't really see that. You see powerful women who are subject to those kinds of comments, catnip comments, by guys who are lower ranked than them, and nobody says anything about it. It was sort of the culture, it was sort of accepted that that's the way business was going to be.
And the other thing that struck me about this article too is that, you know, in most cases we're talking about businesses that have perhaps HR departments as a place to go, but clearly, you know, you talk about this woman who owned her own wealth management firm, and she's subjected to this treatment at a conference. There's no
Recently.
there's no place
day.
to go. So it's more than just the culture of a particular firm, it's the culture of the whole sector. Then what do? I mean, you want to keep working in the sector, right?
Because it's a great financial opportunity. It's a way for you to get ahead. If you're smart and your brain works this way, you can make a lot of money working on Wall Street. But that doesn't mean that men on Wall Street should be given a license to abuse the women on Wall Street.
So you said things have changed to a certain degree.
Well, I think, you know, back in the boom room days, back when firms were private partnerships and they really were boys clubs, you know, anything could happen, and frankly did. As these firms evolved and started going public and had a lot more capital available to them and became, you know, created HR departments, you know, the HR department, part of their mandate was to, you know, instruct people on how to behave properly. But that doesn't mean the behavior really changed all that much. It meant that there were HR departments trying to do what they could to stop it. But one of the things that the women had said to me, who I spoke to for this piece, was that if they did report things to the HR department suddenly wasn't their friend. Their HR department was suddenly in a position of trying to defend the status quo, or the man who was doing the abusing. That's a very prevalent feeling across Wall Street at the moment. Not 20 years ago, today. That HR department is not your friend.
So back in 2015, Ellen Pao made these headlines after she lost a $16 million gender discrimination lawsuit against a Silicon Valley venture capital firm. Right, exactly.
One of the most powerful firms.
One of the most powerful firms. What sort of message does that send? I mean, what we're seeing in Hollywood and in media is men losing their jobs, men losing their careers, and here you have a woman who is alleging gender discrimination and she loses. How does that play with women who are looking to perhaps find a way out of this?
Not great. I mean, not just women, but there's a history of whistleblowers on Wall Street who come forward when they see wrongdoing, not just in sexual abuse situations, but in wrongdoing related to, say, the financial crisis. Whistleblowers who came forward on Wall Street, instead of getting rewarded for doing the right thing, they got fired for trying to do the right thing. Talk about stifling and chilling the idea of wanting to be a whistleblower. What incentive do women have to come forward and report this behavior if there's going to be all this publicity around it, and then they're going to, you know, quote unquote, lose the case because these firms have a lot of money, can hire very powerful lawyers, unlike what seems to be happening, you know, recently in the post-Harvey Weinstein era is that. So we're not talking about adjudication that's gone on.
Right.
We're talking about companies trying to do the right thing when they find that this stuff happened and it becomes exposed and women are coming forward. I think on Wall Street, the first impulse is to deny it, protect the powerful men involved, and then to adjudicate. And, you know, in a courtroom, anything can happen. In front of a jury, anything can happen, especially when there are powerful lawyers and, you know, the facts. I mean, I wrote a whole book about the Duke lacrosse scandal, and in that case, the woman was completely, her arguments were completely subsumed by powerful lawyers who, you know, just made her, the victim, into the person who was the one accusing these kids of wrong behavior and not getting justice.
Do you think, William, that, and this is a question I think for all of us to sort of ruminate on, do you think that the reasons why we've seen it more prevalent in terms of the exposure that it's gotten in movies, in media, and in other industries is because consumers, shareholders, can vote with their wallets? In other words, if you know that Harvey Weinstein is doing these things, not only is it the right thing to do, you know that the public is going to be incensed that you're allowing somebody to have that kind of power, that kind of control. and you're going to vote by not going to those movies. You're going to make it very well known. Wall Street, that has no connection to any consumers. I mean, if your broker is making you money or your banker is making you money, and you know, you're not as concerned, I think the public is not as concerned perhaps as what's going on behind closed doors as they might be with their famous or their favorite film actors and actresses. What do you, I don't know. That's sort of the...
Yeah, it's an interesting, you know, but
because nobody's talking about Wall Street in the way that we are about Hollywood.
I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the guy who ran the entertainment division at Amazon, right? He lost his job because of this. Amazon's obviously a big public company. Whether, you know, shareholders can vote or not, you know, whether they want to own the stock of a company like Amazon, and obviously, you know, this one guy and what he was doing isn't going to affect their decision making. And same thing on Wall Street, really. You know, if Goldman Sachs has 35,000 employees, if there's this ongoing sexual discrimination suit that exists against Goldman now, you know, whether the Goldman wins or loses, it's going to be immaterial to their financial performance, and that's what
investors... And to the folks out in the heartland who don't really care about what's going on with, you know, bankers who are earning hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's a question of whether or not boards of directors, HR departments, CEOs of these firms are going to do the right thing by holding the people who do this kind of thing accountable. In this lawsuit that's ongoing against Goldman Sachs, the allegation is that the person who did this to one of the women there got promoted and paid much more, even though this happened to her. Her career was sidetracked after she reported it. The person who did this to her got promoted and paid and became a partner at Goldman Sachs. But if you really want to change the behavior, you have to make an example of somebody like that, and that person needs to be fired and not promoted and paid more. Until that happens, then there's not going to be any change.
No doubt for businesses, the bottom line is a compelling reason to make significant changes. But I think also what we've seen in a lot of these other industries is that the women are willing to come forward. Even women who have taken settlements and signed non-disclosure agreements have broken those agreements to, you know, let the truth be heard. What we haven't seen this, and that's what you write about, we haven't seen this in this particular industry, but you know, the greater society, it seems, is changing. Do you think that we could see that happen on Wall Street?
Look, I think there's a lot of fear still on Wall Street among women who are afraid to come forward, really, truly afraid. I know women who I talk to who are still very afraid of coming forward. There is a lot of money at stake. There's a long-term career at stake. It's not, frankly, and I don't mean to minimize this, it's not just one film or two films or 5 films. It's a 30 or 40-year career where your earnings power could be in the millions of dollars if you just play along. To have the guts to come forward, to break that. Even I know people who were sexually abused from their days at Lazard, and they know it happened. They are not even working in the industry anymore, and they are still afraid to come forward because these men are very powerful, even if they're not working there anymore. They have a lot of money, and you know, sometimes the path of least resistance can be the easier path. It takes a lot of guts to come forward, and I applaud the women who do come forward.
That's definitely true.
Also, it just feels like with Wall Street that every 5 years there's some scandal, whether it involves issues like this or whether it involves, you know,
financial
shenanigans. And the sense that I always get, and I have a lot of friends still in the industry, it's like everybody hunkers down, this too shall pass. It's been passing since the stock market crash of the 20s, and we're going to come back, and we're going to come back bigger and stronger. The public's attention will be diverted away from us to other things, and I wonder if this will change.
As I wrote about in my book, Why Wall Street Matters, I mean, Wall Street is fundamental to our way of life. Getting access to capital, and the capital that Wall Street provides is fundamental to our way of life. You know, a lot of bad behavior goes on Wall Street. As we know, in the last financial crisis, that no one was held accountable for that. That is a big problem. I think that in large part has added to the growing level of frustration out in the world beyond the Hudson with what happened on Wall Street because no one was held accountable. People need to be held accountable for their bad behavior. In some industries that's happening. On Wall Street, that hasn't happened.
I feel like Wall Street is going to continue to give you a lot to write about in the coming years. William Cohan, thank you so much.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.